Hitler launched his campaign against the Soviet Union in the early hours of 22nd June 1941. At midday on the 23rd, he boarded his private train for the new FHQ in East Prussia, where he arrived late that evening. The site, known as Wolfschanze, lay in a small wooded area east of Rastenburg. It had been built the previous winter and was well camouflaged against aircraft. At the heart of the complex were 10 bunkers with a 2-metre thick concrete roof over the rear section where the sleeping quarters were located. The forward part housed the military planning rooms and offered splinter protection only. The daily situation conferences were held in a large room in Keitel's bunker. The corresponding room in Hitler's bunker was set aside for small-scale conferences. In the middle of the camp were the dining barracks with 2 tables seating 20 and 6 respectively. We moved into Wolfschanze for an indefinite period and settled down to await the first reports of this great war. Warlemont's planning staff and the FHQ commandant and staff were accommodated in normal barracks with a number of bunkers set a little apart from the camp. The OKH quarters were located a few kilometres to the northeast, close by the Rastenburg-Angermund railway line, while Göring and the OKL were accommodated in trains in sidings near Goldab and in the Johannesburger Heide. Among the first reports which the press chief brought was a statement by Churchill. He had been a lifelong opponent of communism, he said, but he now allied himself totally to Russia and against Germany. "We will never parley with Hitler and his gang," he promised. Hitler had expected nothing else from him. The daily routine in FHQ Sperrkreis the Fahre, as the core area was known, differed little from the usual pattern in Berlin. Each day at 12, Hitler would make his way to Keitel's bunker for the main situation conference, which would normally last about 90 minutes. Once or twice a week, Brauchitsch, Halder and Heusinger would attend these briefings. In the afternoons, Hitler would have conversations and dealings with non-military callers, but the subject was always to do with the war. The evening situation conference, chaired by Jodl, followed at 6. Hitler usually ate punctually at 2 in the afternoon and at 7:30. If no special visitors were expected, he would take his time at table, often up to 2 hours. In 1941 and 1942, Bormann's companions Heinrich Heim and Dr. Henry Picker took down the text of many of these conversations in shorthand, and they were subsequently published after the war in numerous reprints under the title Hitler's Tischgespräche, Hitler's Table Talks. In these 2 years, at mealtimes, Hitler spoke freely on many subjects. It might happen that now and again he would seize on a subject, be it about the passion for hunting or horsemanship or whatever, in order to deal a blow to somebody. Meals were Wehrmacht catering and consisted of soup, meat and a dessert. Hitler had his own vegetarian menu which he drew up at breakfast time. The seating arrangement never varied. Hitler sat in the middle with his back to the windows. To his right sat Press Chief Dr. Dietrich, to his left Jodl. Directly opposite him was Keitel, to his right Bormann and to his left Bodenschatz. If there were guests, they would sit between Hitler and Dietrich, or between Keitel and Bodenschatz. The atmosphere at table was free and unforced. Conversation was spontaneous, and there was no kind of compulsion about what could be discussed. On subjects of general interest, when Hitler contributed his opinion, silence would be maintained. It occurred occasionally that he would hold the floor, so to speak, for up to an hour, but this was the exception rather than the rule. The extended mealtimes often forced many younger diners to excuse themselves from table for duty. Hitler never took this the wrong way. In the first week of our stay at Wolfschanze, Hitler forbade the broadcasting of Wehrmacht bulletins. The operations on the Eastern Front were going to plan. There was patchy, stiff resistance, which would have to be smashed by panzers and artillery. It soon became clear that this delaying resistance was directed by specially able officers, NCOs or political commissars who dominated the men under them and made it violently clear that they were there to fight. If these leaders were captured, they were summarily executed. However, the overall picture in the first few days was, as expected, variable. A comprehensive letter which I wrote to my uncle on 28th of June conveys my impressions at that time. Reports about the advance and operations have been withheld so as not to provide the Russians with a picture of the situation. The first bulletins will probably start tomorrow. The initial evidence is that Russia has made far greater preparations for this war than we assumed, but probably they did not expect a date before 1943, by when the build-up and arming of their forces would have been completed. The Russian army made a stand with assault groups and motorized units first around Lemberg, then at Bialystok, and finally Kovno. Their defensive installations were still under construction. Northwest of Lemberg, near Rawa Ruska, and northwest of Grodno bunker installations were discovered, which were laid out on the west wall pattern. The front line was completed, but the two rear sections were still under construction. The ease of our early victories along the whole front came as a surprise to both Army and Luftwaffe. Enemy aircraft were parked in neat rows on their airfields and could be destroyed without difficulty. 4 panzer groups carried the weight of our attack. Kleist from Lublin towards Rono-Shitomir, Guderian via Brest to Minsk, Hoth from Gumbinnen, via Vilna to Minsk, and Höpner, north of Gumbinnen, via Kovno to Donneberg. A part of Guderian's group is heading for the Beresina near Bobruisk. The Russian is putting up a good fight everywhere, sometimes so tough and determined that our troops have a fierce battle. The main reason behind it is undoubtedly the communist commissars who, pistol in hand, force their men to fight until shot dead. The Russian communist propaganda has succeeded in convincing their men that they are fighting a war against barbaric savages, and that no prisoners are being taken. This explains why many soldiers, but especially officers and commissars, commit suicide when faced with surrender. Often they place a primed hand grenade against the chest. Our advance has gone off surprisingly swiftly. On the northern flank in Lithuania and in the centre around Bialystok, the enemy is falling apart. Their command structure has failed completely. Individual groups are trying to break out of the cauldron. From Donneberg, our forces are heading to the Papus Sea to block their escape. The stiffest resistance is in the south. Here the leadership is good. Rundstedt, who is commander there, says that he has not come up against such a good opponent at any time in this war. Since yesterday evening, however, the enemy seems to be weakening. Therefore, we are hurrying to form a bag. From northern Romania, a German army will meet up with the Romanians and connect up with Kleist. Those are broadly their opening operations. The next major targets will be the Donetsk Basin, Moscow and Leningrad. The men are saying that the Russian gives a repulsive impression. They are a confused racial mix with Asiatic appearance and manners. Russian tanks and aircraft are poor, much inferior to ours, and tend to be deployed in small numbers. This enables our forces to score highly. They seem to have a good supply of tanks, but our troops are so superior that we can look to the future with confidence. These were the first impressions our troops had gained of the enemy. I flew in a Storch to the front to obtain an idea of affairs for myself. In the Lithuanian area, for example, a German unit came across a giant field of corn. There was a lot of shooting coming from within. Gradually we established that the cornfield concealed hundreds of young Russian Asiatics who had been thrown into the fray and left to it. There was fear in their faces since they were expecting to be shot out of hand. It took an age to round them all up. The month of July found most in an optimistic frame of mind at FHQ. Hitler saw himself confirmed in his judgment. Neither Brauchitsch nor Halder, Keitel nor Jodl had a word to say to the contrary. Whether they all shared Hitler's outlook, I was unable to determine. However, as we know from his published diary notes, on 3rd of July, Halder considered that the campaign against Russia would be won within the next 14 days if it was not already won. Personally, I did not share this opinion. There was certainly an astonishingly high bag of prisoners. Army Group Centre reported over 250,000 on 9th of July. But it was a permanent flow, constantly, increasing. On 16th of July, Hitler went so far as to create the Ostministerium covering Russia and the Baltic, and awarded the competent office to Reichsleiter Alfred Rosenberg. This decision caused a mild sensation, and many difficulties were predicted with it, as indeed duly came to pass. That month, Hitler awarded to Oberst Mölders as the first Wehrmacht recipient the swords and diamonds to the oak leaves of the Knight's Cross. In January 1942, Galland was similarly honoured. The two airmen maintained a friendly chase. Hitler took the opportunity to discuss with them in detail problems of the air war in the West. From both, I gained the impression that they were anxious to give voice to certain doubts and worries. They spoke frankly and without reserve. Hitler listened attentively. Galland complained of false press and radio reports, and of the condescending and arrogant tone adopted when referring to the RAF. At the conclusion of this conversation, Hitler gave Galland to understand, in the winter crisis of early 1942, that Germany had already broken the back of the Red Army. I can still hear Galland's question to me afterwards. "Is that right?" I did not reply. In those July days of 1941, it seemed to me that Hitler was overestimating the operational success of the campaign. The number of prisoners taken by Army Group Centre was no doubt impressive, but Russia had an immeasurable reserve of people. Furthermore, as our divisions rolled ever onwards into the vastness of the Russian hinterland, we would encounter greater problems. Above all, we would need time. Hitler's intentions, ever since the initial plans had been first drafted, was to seize all Baltic ports, including Leningrad, and in the south, the entire Black Sea coast as far as Rostov. In order to hammer home this point afresh with the military commanders, on the spot we flew to Malnava, Army Group North, on 21st of July. General Feldmarschall Ritter von Leeb had been firmly opposed to the campaign from the start, but exuded optimism and saw no obstacles blocking his advance, provided that he received reinforcements from Panzer Group 3. Hitler reminded him of how much importance was being attached to the taking of the Baltic ports and the setting up of a link with the Finns through the port of Leningrad. OKH, and so it appeared, Army Group Centre had certain reservations about the operation which Hitler did not share. The arguments were still going on at the end of July when Hitler fell ill for a few days. He failed to appear for meals and the daily situation conferences. It was quite obvious from his appearance how miserable he felt. Dr. Morell said it was probably a slight apoplexy. Hitler's heart and circulation were not in good order, but within a short while he would return the Führer to his former self. After a few days there was a noticeable improvement. We were ordered to observe the strictest silence about Hitler's condition. This was a health crisis with potentially serious consequences, however, and it worried me sufficiently to confide it to my brother on 30th July. On 3rd August, we flew to Borisov to see Bock C&C Army Group Centre. Brauchitsch and Halder were also there. Hitler had long talks with them. In the forefront of these conversations was the ratio of strength, opposing troop numbers, and the size of the territory to be conquered. 12% of the world's land surface. All three generals stressed the idea that Army Group Centre should have the single objective of taking Moscow. They were in an optimistic frame of mind and said that, after a few days to re-equip and regroup, they could go on to take Moscow before the bad weather set in. Hitler did not approve this proposition, referring to the view he had asserted prior to the campaign that Army Group Centre was to halt beyond Smolensk, while Army Group North took Leningrad and Army Group South took Rostov. Subsequently, the two groups would stream out from these two centres and drive in the direction of Moscow, the two spearheads meeting up east of the city. Both sides were stubborn, and no decision came, despite the length of the talks. I remember Borisov for another reason. Two royal princes, whom I knew through my service, spoke to me about Hitler's order that all descendants of the former German ruling houses were not to fight at the front, but be placed in positions to the rear. All they wanted was the chance to do their duty as any other front officer. Basically, Hitler held the princes in high esteem and recognized their bravery in the field. I have described the political reason for this order and Hitler's uncompromising stand on it. I was unable to help the princes in any way. They understood this and went off considering themselves second-class officers. On 14 August, we received the report that Churchill and Roosevelt had held talks aboard the battleship Prince of Wales and had issued a declaration known as the Atlantic Charter. In paragraph 1, this document states that the United States and Britain renounced any enlargement of state territory. The remaining 7 paragraphs contained general but very reasonable sounding concepts about rights of peoples, world trade, and the elimination of force. Hitler flew into a passion of rage and was particularly upset by point 6, which promised the final elimination of the National Socialist tyranny. He said that was something they would never achieve. Hitler advocated single-mindedly his military plan for the East. OKH opposed him with all means at their command. On 18th August, Brauchitsch argued, in his memorandum, the further operations of Army Group Center, for the immediate resumption of the drive on Moscow. Panzer Groups Guderian and Hoth needed rest. After they were ready, he estimated 2 more months to achieve the goal. Hitler's answer of 21st August expressed the opposite opinion. The army's suggestion as to the continuation of operations in the East does not coincide with my intentions. The most important goal to be achieved before the onset of winter is not Moscow, but the Crimea, the coal and industrial regions of the Donets, cutting off oil supplies from the Caucasus, and in the north, the capture of Leningrad and the establishment of a corridor to the Finns. 4 further points explained what was required of the 3 army groups. Halder described this directive in his diary as decisive for the outcome of the campaign. The long argument between Hitler and OKH got on one's nerves. I remember exactly what Hitler had said before the campaign. Over and over, he emphasized his conviction that Leningrad and Rostov were the key cities. He said several times that Moscow need not be taken until the second operation, perhaps not until 1942. Therefore, the current controversy went back to the planning stages. Even Guderian was drawn into it. Bock thought it was a good idea to send Guderian, commander of Panzer Group 2, to FHQ to put forward the case for moving on Moscow. He arrived on 23rd of August, presented the argument, and was seduced by Hitler's counter-argument. Hitler was incensed by the time that was being wasted on the matter. On 25th of August, Mussolini arrived at Wolfschanze to inspect Italian units fighting alongside Army Group South. Next day, Hitler accompanied him to Brest-Litovsk, and then onwards to FHQ South, from where, on the 28th, they dropped in on an Italian division moving up to the front. It was not pleasant. Mussolini had no concept of the Eastern Front and the problems confronting Hitler. After his guest had departed, Hitler expressed his disappointment to his circle of officers. The Italians could offer very little on the Eastern Front. They had no fighting strength worth speaking of. He said wryly that they were here for the purposes of good morale. He spoke often about his long discussion with Mussolini, emphasizing that it was still necessary to flirt with the Italians since the fighting in the Mediterranean theatre was not yet over. The Hungarian Regent Admiral Horthy stayed at Wolfschanze from 6th to 8th of September at Hitler's invitation. Hitler gave him a broad picture of the situation at the front and discussed with him the different problems which the war in general was causing. Horthy also visited Goering and Brauchitsch, and at Marienburg, Hitler invested him with the Knight's Cross. As he explained later, a purely political gesture. At Wolfschanze, later as usual listened with interest to Hitler's comments about one of his state guests. As far as the war was concerned, Germany was expecting nothing from Hungary, he said, but for peace in the Balkans. Good neighbours were important, and, after all, Germany was still dependent on the Romanian oil fields. Thus, he was satisfied that the object of the visit had been achieved. Dispatches submitted during August by Army Group South contained reports of the first atrocities committed by Soviet troops. They were so appalling that even Hitler was doubtful, and he sent me to Nikolaev to check with the 16th Panzer Division. I spoke there with General Hubie and a very good friend of mine, Udo von Alvensleben. They described to me the discovery of the corpses of more than 100 murdered soldiers of 6th Rifle Regiment 79, i.e. the 6th Company of the 79th Regiment, at Grigovo Station. At another place, German prisoners had been drawn and quartered alive. Our troops had responded accordingly. When I explained the facts to Hitler at Wolfschanze, he thought about it for some time and said finally that General Staff ought to know, then they might take a different view of the sort of enemy we were fighting against. When Admiral Canaris called into FHQ about this time, he made an allegation against me to Schmundt. Canaris had told him that on a certain date before the beginning of the Russian campaign, my wife had telephoned one of her sisters at Halberstadt and told her that Hitler would attack Russia on 22nd of June. Schmundt had been obliged to inform Hitler, who dismissed the whole thing at once with a wave of the hand. Schmundt was very impressed by Hitler's reaction. I told Schmundt that if he had discussed it with me beforehand, I could have shown him that when the telephone conversation was supposed to have been made, the date for the attack had not been set, and that Canaris's report was false. I heard nothing more about the incident either from Hitler or from elsewhere. Also in August, Goebbels appeared for the first time, at Hitler's wish in FHQ. In the 2 days of his stay, he had private talks with Hitler on several occasions. It seeped out eventually that the Jewish question had been discussed. Goebbels and Heydrich were pressing for a solution. Goebbels wanted Hitler's permission to expel Berlin's remaining 70,000 Jews. Hitler was not yet ready for this, but agreed that Jews should be distinguished by a special badge. On 1st of September, a police decree published in the Reichsgesetzblatt ordered that henceforth all Jews were required to wear prominently a yellow Star of David on their clothing. It appeared that the problem would not be finally resolved until after the conclusion of the Russian campaign, and then in großzügiger Weise, on the grand scale. I did not understand the cynicism of this remark until after the war, when, in the summer months of 1945 and later at the Nuremberg trials, the extent of the Jewish Holocaust became known. The Berlin police decree was the initial stage of preparation for the final solution, in which Göring, in his police function, had a significant involvement. Personally, I had no knowledge of the activities of the SS and police Einsatzgruppen responsible for the murder of large numbers of Jews in the occupied territories, nor did I know of the transportations of Jews to death camps in the East after 1941 from a catchment area comprised of all conquered European countries. I also know nothing of the Wannsee Conference of 20 January 1942. After the war, particularly from many conversations when in custody, I was able to put together certain circumstantial pointers, which really ought to have given me cause to reflect towards the war's end on the significance of Hitler's increasing anti-Jewish sentiments, or on some incidental remarks made by senior SS officers. Along with many others, I believed the explanation for the rumoured Jewish deportations to the East that they were required there as a labour force for important war factories. In view of the increasing use of domestic and foreign forced labour at the time, this was not implausible. I know now, of course, that I was the victim of a wicked deception. I find it extraordinary that it was possible to conceal this genocide behind a veil of secrecy. My family and my wife's family had no Jewish friends or acquaintances, and during the war we lived in a certain isolation. Neither my family nor any of our relations, friends or service comrades received knowledge by direct means. Führerbefehl Nr. 1 had been effective here. In a system such as that of National Socialism, with an efficient secret police which spied on civilians and military alike, certain themes were taboo, even in our circle. In any case, I am absolutely convinced, even in the absence of documentary evidence, that the extermination of the Jews resulted from Hitler's express order, since it is inconceivable that Himmler and Göring could have operated an independent policy without his knowledge. Certainly Himmler would not have informed him as to the individual details, but in this matter Himmler acted with Hitler's full agreement and approbation. Despite the bickering with OKH, Hitler still took a positive view of the war situation in the summer of 1941. He was of the opinion that during September, Stalin would be forced to bolster the front with his last reserves. If these could be bled white, resistance would cease, and our units could roll onwards. This outlook lasted for some time, until the receipt of fresh reports which spoke of tough resistance and heavy fighting. Thus, it seemed that the Red Army retreat was either organised or ragged, depending on location. The question as to whether the attack on Moscow should be carried out this year or next was finally settled when Hitler gave in to the army's entreaties. And on 6th of September, Jodl issued Directive No. 35 that the operation by Army Group Centre against Timoshenko is to be prepared in such a manner that the attack can be mounted early at the end of September, and not until the expected victory over the mass of Timoshenko's army group had been achieved can Army Group Centre set out in pursuit towards Moscow. Jodl was convinced that this battle would deprive the Russians of any real potential to defend their capital, and he repeated this opinion in subsequent situation conferences. On the 2nd October, Hitler travelled to Berlin for the opening of the Winter Relief Programme and, in his speech, harangued Great Britain as usual. Of the Russian campaign, he observed that we had come as close as a hair's breadth, not only to the destruction of Germany, but of all Europe. He continued, "I can say today that this enemy has been broken and will never rise again." He had been building his strength against Europe, something of which most had unfortunately no suspicion, and many today still have no suspicion. It would have been a second Mongol invasion by a no Genghis Khan. On the conclusion of this speech, Hitler returned to Wolfschanze at once. The events on the Eastern Front preoccupied him. The twin battle of Bryansk-Vyazma between 2 and the 12th October was expected to create a favourable centre for the advance. In the event, over 660,000 prisoners were taken and many tanks and field guns captured, and it seemed that an open road to Moscow lay before us. But then came the rains, earlier than normal, and with them the mud. Many units stuck fast in the morass. Our troops tired. The enemy used the time to regroup, block the gaps and structure new resistance, and with that, the advance came to a halt. Pessimism began to gain ground, fed by false rumours and gossip. Some of it percolated through to FHQ and Hitler himself. A much discussed change at the end of September was the replacement of Baron von Neurath by SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich as Reich Protector for Bohemia and Moravia. Heydrich, a capable and determined SS functionary, presented himself in advance of the official call and set out at once to cut down the Czech resistance movement. Although he was a radical and uncompromising National Socialist, he carried out his mission in Prague with great skill, and not solely by the use of police brutality. He succeeded in subduing the region, kept the armaments factories working, and paved the way for a positive development of the relationship between Germans and Czechs. In North Africa, meanwhile, Rommel had been beaten back. The British had been strengthened, and the relationship with the Italian ally was not good. There had been serious problems of supply. Thus, not much had gone right for Rommel in the summer of 1941, and he had been forced to let the British drive him back. Hitler was not too concerned. He knew Rommel well enough to realise that eventually he would return to the offensive, even without much in the way of reinforcements. Since the beginning of the Russian campaign, I had actually been without special duties. The Luftwaffe had transferred its rested units to the east, where, in the opening days of the offensive, they had destroyed huge numbers of Soviet warplanes on the ground. Afterwards, their activities were reduced to a support role for the army. Here von Richthofen's Fliegerkorps Zeit distinguished itself. The general spent all day aloft, mostly in a Storch, flying from one hotspot to another, and was correspondingly often better informed about the ground situation than most senior army commanders. His advice led to considerable debate on occasion, but generally he got his way. In the summer weeks, I spent a good deal of time with Luftwaffe units and gained the impression that the army did not make the best of its opportunities. This was due in part to the great distances involved and the tendency of many army commanders to rush things. In general, however, the Luftwaffe showed little understanding either. Jeschonek's door was always open to me, and he kept me informed of affairs. He was in despair at the renewed postponement of the Luftwaffe aircraft production program. He said we could not afford to lose any more time because in recent weeks aircraft losses at the front were not being made good. He wanted a substantial increase in production immediately, since the deployment of the Luftwaffe along the Channel coast remained crucial. He said that if Hitler would not allow the program to go through, this alone could prevent us ever winning the war against Britain. I broached the subject with Hitler. He knew about the problem but said the army had priority. This state of affairs would change in the spring of 1942. Then he would switch all production capacity to the Luftwaffe. I also mentioned to him that although for the present the British appeared content to mount relatively minor air raids on our cities, we had to reckon with an escalation in due course. He agreed, but believed that the Luftwaffe could bridge the gap. I could not accept this opinion and contradicted him. He nodded and said he would discuss the question with Goering. My duties as Luftwaffe adjutant began to have a larger dimension. There was no set schedule for me to follow, and I arranged my tasks to suit myself. Until now, Hitler had interested himself almost exclusively in the numbers of operational aircraft. Questions were now being put about when such and such squadrons were going to be equipped, when aircraft requirements would be met and the like. Therefore, I had to keep myself permanently supplied with statistics and update my own records accordingly. Obtaining details about flak was not a job which I did with much relish, but it was essential because Hitler laid value on it for a special reason. On the Eastern Front, large numbers of Russian tanks were appearing which were better armoured than anything we had come up against previously, and these could only be knocked out with the 8-point seat or flak gun. Hitler hammered the point hard that the flak corps on the Eastern Front was to be equipped exclusively with the 8-point series in order to be able to engage these tanks and take part in the land fighting. On 1st November, at OKH, an exhibition of army winter uniforms was put on display. The Quartermaster General, Wagner, assured Hitler that work on winter clothing was in hand, and that sufficient quantities would be made available to men in the field. Hitler took note of the report and appeared satisfied. On the 7th, he went to Munich to make his annual speech to the 1923 veterans. On the 9th, he addressed the Reichs- and Gauleiters before returning immediately to Wolfschanze. I parted from Hitler at Munich to take the cure at Constance. My wife accompanied me. A special diet was prescribed for my nervous stomach condition. The 4 weeks preceding 8th December passed without special incident. From what I could make out, all movement on the front had stopped. There were few fresh reports in the press. I was shaken to read of the deaths of Udet and Mulders. Udet's death on 17th November was supposed to have occurred in a flying accident, but I thought this unlikely and established from telephone inquiries to Berlin that he had committed suicide. I felt the loss keenly. I knew him well from my flying days. He was a person of rare likability. Goering had appointed him Generalluftzugmeister. The post handled aircraft production and supply, and Udet considered it a step down. He was a bachelor who enjoyed life, always surrounded by a circle of good friends. They offered him support, but he saw things differently and could not be influenced. His death affected the whole Luftwaffe. Mulders was killed on 22nd November on the way to Udet's funeral when the aircraft in which he was a passenger crashed while making an intermediate stop at Breslau. His death was a serious blow, especially for the fighter arm. My wife and I arrived at Berlin-Anhalter station early on 9th December. Loudspeakers urged all passengers to hurry since the platform was needed urgently. I knew that this was the particular platform alongside which Hitler's special train usually drew, and assumed that he was returning to Berlin. From my apartment, I telephoned the Chancellery and found that Hitler was expected. I dressed in my uniform and was driven there. I had no presentiment of how the political situation had changed, nor of what lay ahead in the next few weeks. I reported to Hitler. He was very friendly and asked me how the cure had gone. I had myself informed as to recent events, the most important of which was the Japanese attack against the US naval base at Pearl Harbor without a declaration of war on 7th of December. Hitler had interpreted this event as the signal for Germany to declare war on the United States. I was appalled at his unworldliness and innocence as to an industrial potential which just over 20 years previously had been decisive in the Great War. It exposed the amateurism of his foreign policy and his deficient knowledge of the world beyond Europe. He was relying for the foreseeable future on the hope that the conflict between the USA and Japan would keep the Americans out of the European theatre. He was convinced that his Weltblitzkrieg, as the historian Andreas Hillgruber calls it, in which all enemies are vanquished swiftly one after the other, would be successful. Presumably, this also meant that he would hasten to the aid of Japan, since he spoke repeatedly of the need for closer German-Japanese military cooperation. If so, I thought this would not be a good move. At the time, his preferred foreign policy conversational partner was Huel, but ultimately Hitler's extra-European political ideas were based more on his wishes than on reality. The day of my return was one of turmoil. Many visitors gathered in the Chancellery in the hope of obtaining from the horse's mouth the latest about the war situation, but the matter was not for discussion. After lunch, Hitler spoke with Ribbentrop, Himmler, Todt, and Goering. The rooms emptied. Schmundt supplied me with the business of the day. Then I was left alone with Hitler, and we talked. In the evening, we strolled the Winter Garden. He was wrestling with the question of the Army High Command. He had had no confidence in Brauchitsch for some time, and was looking for a replacement. Schmundt had recommended that he assume supreme command of the army himself, at least temporarily. Hitler had bristled at the very suggestion, but after the declaration of war on the United States, he saw a new situation developing, and began to incline more and more towards Schmundt's suggestion. Hitler was of the opinion that many generals needed to be rested. He had sent Rundstedt on leave on the 1st of December and was worried about Guderian, who was totally drained. He had given Army Group South to Reichenau, whom he trusted implicitly. Hitler was very concerned at the situation with Army Group Centre. He assumed that the Russians were planning a major counterattack. Klug spoke of nothing but drawing back. "How far back does he want to come?" Hitler asked. "We have no prepared positions to the rear. The army must stop where it is." Then he reproached the army supply organisation. The army had no winter clothing, no protection against the bitter cold, and no efficient means of catering. Hitler was outraged. How could the army not have prepared for it? The Luftwaffe had managed to provide its units with all their winter requirements. Hitler said that the Russians were now attacking everywhere in large numbers with the T-34. The army had no effective anti-tank gun against it. Even the short-barreled Panzer Mk4 found it a handful. If we didn't have the Luftwaffe 8.8 cm Flak, these Russian tanks would go where they liked, he said. In the T-34 the Russians had a weapon of note, and he did not yet know in what numbers it was being supplied. It would soon be confirmed in 1942 that it was arriving at the front in constantly growing numbers. Our own panzer production was satisfactory, but we needed to accelerate the pace. Hitler also mentioned American supplies to the Russians. He knew for certain that they had been supplying lorries and provisions to the Soviets for some time because German units had identified them. He was mentally at the front and always trying to imagine ways to help the men in the field. But he kept repeating, "They must stand where they are, not a step backwards." Hitler convened the Reichstag for Spiegelmind, 3 o'clock on the afternoon of 11th December. He made a long and comprehensive speech about the whole political situation without working up to any special high point. Upon our return to Wolfschanze, on the morning of 16th December, the situation at the front was confused and worrying. That night, Hitler decided at last to assume command of the army. He had been thinking about it for several days. Schmundt welcomed his announcement, if only because it brought to an end the daily struggle with Brauchitsch. Hitler had considered entrusting the high command to Manstein or Kesselring, but Manstein was unsuited by temperament, and Hitler needed Kesselring as Luftwaffe C&C in the Mediterranean because he did not want to unsettle the Italians with a surprise change. On the 18th of December, he replaced Bock with Klug as C&C Army Group Centre. The day had begun with a number of urgent telephone conversations, all of which requested permission to pull back Army Group Centre under the weight of the Soviet counter-offensive. Hitler would not concede a step and insisted that they stay where they were. At Klug's request, Guderian was sent on leave for Christmas and New Year. The two generals could not stand each other. Hitler and Halder were spending hours each day in conference. It was always the same theme: to stay put or draw back. Meanwhile, the front was being shored up by reinforcing the sections under the heaviest threat and throwing in the last reserves. Just before midnight on 30th December, Hitler began a 2-hour-long telephone conversation with Klug, who wanted to retreat 35 kilometers. Hitler refused and told him to stand his ground. This undoubtedly saved the situation, although serious crises still lay ahead over the next few weeks. After the declaration of war on the United States, we knew that now we faced virtually the whole world, knowledge which made it difficult for me to continue to believe in victory. In Germany, opinions began to shift. The vast majority of the people remembered Hitler's successes, and either did not or could not believe that the man who had restored German prestige in the world could be taking a false path. Amongst them were many who no longer expected outright victory, but who said that such a great man would find the way to maintain the welfare of the Reich. Other people of this group, and there were many, had no opinion at all and were happy to let events take their course. There remained a small, even a very small circle, who perceived clearly Germany's great misfortune, who discussed it, and who were even prepared to risk everything to destroy it. Individuals from the churches, landed gentry, diplomats, government officials, and military officers. The Gestapo knew all about them. They had most of the names in their card indexes. They took no action, for the number was small and there was no evidence to go on. Himmler kept Hitler advised, and the latter knew the names of most of the active opposition. Since even in Sommerjähristen, early 1941, Hitler had spoken out vehemently against critical trends, it was not surprising that opposition should increase at a time of winter setbacks. At the time, I believed that the Soviet Union, which since June had been taking very heavy punishment, would find it impossible to recover quickly. I thought there was still a chance to strike at Russia before America, with all her enormous potential, entered the fighting proper. As far as I could judge, this was also Hitler's view. He was certain he would defeat Russia in 1942. Ribbentrop was advising Hitler to seek a peace treaty with the USSR. He believed he had got to know Stalin very well in 1939, and considered that not all possibilities had yet been exhausted. He argued his case in depth, but Hitler said that a peaceful solution was impossible. In his New Year statement to the German people and an order of the day to the Wehrmacht, Hitler admitted the difficult situation in which Germany found herself in these winter months, but he left no doubt that he would regain the initiative and continue the struggle for Lebensraum. Whoever fights for the life of his people, for their daily bread and for their future, will be victorious. But whoever by this war, with its Jewish hate, seeks to annihilate the people, will fall, he exclaimed. His order of the day concluded with the words, "The blood spilled in this war will be, this is our hope, the last in Europe for generations. May the Lord God help us therein in the coming year." In the autumn and winter months of 1941, Hitler experienced for the first time how a retreat fanned enemy resistance into flame. His assumption of supreme command of the army was a successful move, since it prevented the catastrophe into which a withdrawal would have degenerated. Instead, the German soldier found new reserves of strength and confidence from the knowledge of his superhuman achievement in holding off a superior enemy, sometimes 20 times his own strength. Hitler would not countenance withdrawals to gain freedom of manoeuvre or to spare his forces. His burgeoning mistrust of the generals, a sentiment of which he was never to rid himself entirely, cramped him, since he insisted now on reserving to himself even the most minor tactical decisions. The lack of fresh, rested divisions, Hitler had thrown all 41 available divisions into the front, was the reason for the reckless deployment of men. He had no reserves worth speaking of. The Russian landmass was too big for the German Wehrmacht. It was almost 2,000 miles from Leningrad to Mount Elbrus in the Caucasus. At the outset of the campaign, Hitler assumed that he would quickly break the enemy's back as he had in former invasions. But Russia was different. The enemy had inexhaustible reserves. Over the winter of 1941-42, it became apparent to Hitler that his army was too small. As we know today, Stalin was able to leave his far eastern frontier unprotected because the communist spy Richard Surger in Sindiri, Tokyo, had shown him that the Japanese did not want war with Russia. This knowledge, together with American assistance, gave Stalin strength to withstand the German attack, to put Hitler's armies on the defensive, and, in the winter of 1941-42, to push them to the edge of the abyss. This was the great turning point of the war. Hitler's optimism in his war against the world remained unimpaired, for he still believed that Britain, if faced with losing her empire, would rather abandon the war against Germany. This was a slim hope, but Hitler saw Britain relying increasingly on the United States, and from this he inferred the central importance of the USA. Hitler still considered that he could strengthen and consolidate the German position in the spring of 1942. In the event, the Red Army attacked repeatedly all along the German front. They achieved limited success, but even though they broke through the German lines, in some places, a really significant penetration eluded them. The encirclements at Demyansk and Cholm proved how it was possible to make a heroic stand when adequately supplied from the air. Despite Schmundt's efforts, an improvement in Hitler's relationship with the generals was scarcely to be hoped for. When speaking with Bormann, Göring or Himmler about them, Hitler was often dismissive or harsh in his condemnation. Few of the generals who came into contact with Hitler knew him sufficiently well. They behaved correctly and were inhibited about informing Hitler of problems or difficulties. As adjutants, we used to speak to these visitors beforehand, suggesting that the best approach was to be unself-conscious. A few succeeded. Most natural were the young officers who came to receive the Knight's Cross or other decorations from Hitler's hand. In my experience, these were always Luftwaffe officers, and there was scarcely one who lost his tongue in Hitler's presence. He could be told unpleasant truths, and in fact he valued receiving bad reports as early as possible. The manner in which they were presented was naturally important. In the Luftwaffe, a basic change resulted from the death of Udet. Hitler and Göring transferred to Milch responsibility for all Luftwaffe production and supply. Göring did this reluctantly, but Hitler willed it, and probably Göring saw no other solution. Milch was robust, inconsiderate, demanding, radical, and hard with himself. He was appalled at the disorder in which he found the office of Generalluftzugmeister, and determined to put things straight. His priority was to increase the monthly production of aircraft. For 1942, he wanted to double the December 1941 figures from 250 to almost 500 machines monthly. He would not go so far as to authorize the changeover to 4-engine bombers at this stage. He saw as his principal task an increase in fighter aircraft. He knew about current British aircraft production and their huge bomber program. Against these, Milch would need primarily fighters and flak. At the end of January 1942, he presented his ideas at FHQ. Hitler made his stock reply that for the time being the army took absolute precedence. This was understandable, but nevertheless I took the opportunity to bring up again the subject of Luftwaffe difficulties. I foresaw, as did Milch, British air raids escalating without there being sufficient air defences to combat them. Hitler pointed to the end of 1942, when Russia would be broken. I did not believe that, but said nothing. The fact was, Hitler had always turned out to be right in the end,